Dominic Cummings and Boris Johnson have reached the zenith of politics through their ability to judge the public mood, to know that most stories are in the bubble. They'll write 99 times out of 100. People barely notice, but when they do, they really, really do.
He should be punished just like everyone else. People are still being fined. It's hypocrisy in the middle of the government. There's one rule for one rule for another.
We're seeing people who are being prosecuted for not following the guidelines, and yet he's getting away with it.
We've had 3 days now of story, counter-story, counter to the counter-story about this now infamous journey. A fragmented assortment of facts and accounts which often seems not to cohere to that we heard just hours before. This is what we do know about the strange case of Mr. Dominic Cummings and his trip to Durham and what effect it might have. Initially, we were told that Mr. Cummings and his family stayed at his father's property throughout his period in County Durham, and Downing Street rubbished suggestions to the contrary.
Look, the important thing is that everyone remains in the same place whilst they're locked down, which is exactly what happened in, I think, the case you're referring to with Mr. Cummings. So the Prime Minister will have known he was staying put.
We now know that this is not true.
We agreed that we should go for a short drive to see if I could drive safely. We drove for roughly half an hour and ended up on the outskirts of Barnard Castle town.
And yet ministers say this.
My view is that what he did was within the guidelines.
In fact, the guidelines on April the 12th were clear. Please stay local and use open space near to your home where possible. Don't travel unnecessarily. The cardinal guidelines of social distancing about why you could leave the house were also still in place. So the rules then are clear. He could only leave for exercise, for shopping or for emergencies. The Barnard Castle trip was none of the above. Nonetheless, ministers continue to say that the trip was within the rules. In a story, though, with some grey areas, this simply isn't one of them. On any measure, Dominic Cummings broke the rules when he made that Barnard Castle trip.
You're supposed to be more than 2 metres apart.
Mr. Cummings' defence also rests on the idea of exceptionality. There is a section of the rules which allows for some discretion for truly exceptional cases where there are safeguarding issues. It's difficult to argue, however, that this was an exceptional case. Millions of others were in the same position as he. There are also people with situations of far greater gravity. No wonder people are so angry.
Not only is the actions of Dominic Cummings undermined that stay-at-home message, that the Prime Minister and the government ministers that have come out now to defend him have also undermined that message, and that now really have no authority to ask people to stay at home or maintain social distancing measures when they're endorsing what Dominic Cummings has done.
And if you think about it even for a little bit, it quickly becomes clear how that exceptionality couldn't possibly have applied to Mr. Cummings' initial decision to make the trip to County Durham.
Yesterday I gave a full...
Mr. Cummings initially said that he thought it likely that he and his wife had COVID. That's why he decided to travel. Then he said,
I discussed the situation with my wife. She was ill. She might have COVID, though she did not have a cough or a fever.
This is the problem. Mr. Cummings' defence is partly quite circular. On the one hand, he says that he had to go to Durham partly because of his wife's symptoms. But if she had had COVID symptoms, then she would have been forbidden from travelling, and that would have been against the rules. So then he says that in fact she didn't have COVID symptoms, and as a matter of fact, neither did he. But if that's the case, there was no need to make the trip to Durham in the first place. There was no safeguarding issue for the child. In either case, there was little exceptionality, and given that he travelled with the disease, certainly in his car, it is very bizarre for ministers to claim, as they have now started to do, that Mr. Cummings acted in a way which helped suppress the virus.
In the case of Dominic, what he sought to do was to ensure that he and his family were not in a position where they risked spreading the infection to others.
In the meantime, many of the scientists that Mr. Cummings so admires and who are advising the government about COVID are tearing their hair out.
This is a health crisis that's of momentous significance for this country. To treat it as though it was a political crisis and about reputation is problematic, because if it's about reputation, then you're potentially sacrificing lives of the population to preserve the reputation of a government. And I think personally that obviously most people would, the lives of the population are more important.
People may well have some sympathy with Mr. Cummings, and indeed, if his defence had been that he simply broke the rules as a father to do the best for his family, then that would be one thing. But that is not Mr. Cummings' defence. Mr. Cummings' defence is that he didn't break the rules at all. As we've shown, by any reasonable interpretation, that is not the case. And ministers are saying the same thing, that he didn't break the rules. And though it would be very tempting to simply focus on Mr. Cummings, the truth is that he is only there because he enjoys the confidence of the Prime Minister. If this country's public health strategy and response is affected by this episode, the buck will stop with him. This is no longer a story just about Mr. Cummings' actions. Now it's about how ministers are describing them, their straightforwardness with those who elect them. Dominic Cummings' politics, in all its bombast, was on display this weekend. We are, perhaps, about to see if the public have tired of it.
Lewis Goodall with that report. Well, we asked the government to come on this evening. They told us, do join in at home if you know the words. No one was available. Joining us now, though, Ian Blackford, the leader of the SNP in Westminster, and the Conservative MPs, Craig Whitaker and Andrew Bridgen. If I can start with you, Craig, Lewis has comprehensively showed the ways in which Dominic Cummings broke the rules. Why do you think that the government has refused to recognise or acknowledge that?
Well, I don't know is the answer. What I can tell you, though, is that, look, Dominic has made a decision. All I can do and all anybody can do is take that at face value. The problem, though, is that Dominic Cummings is not taking responsibility for that decision. And for somebody who sits on stage and takes all the scientific advice and then advises our Prime Minister, who then advises the country, it is really an untenable position to be in. I respect he's taking a decision, but what I can't get my head around is why he can't take responsibility for that decision. And surely he must realise, as the Prime Minister must realise, his position is untenable.
Well, you've called for him to go, but what happens if he doesn't?
Well, that isn't down to the backbench MPs. All we can do is try and put pressure on the government and try and relay what our constituents are talking about. And I'm not talking about the hard Brexiteers that have been contacting us or indeed the hard momentum people. I'm talking about the majority of the emails in my inbox and that I've been dealing with for the last 2 months from people that have suffered real hardship because of this lockdown that Mr. Cummings advised the Prime Minister on what to do for the right reasons, but he must take responsibility. So that's my view.
What do you think is more damaging, that he's allowed to break the rules and stay, or that this undermines government health messages and could potentially, as we heard earlier, cost lives?
Well, I don't buy this that it actually undermines the public health messages, because the majority of people, particularly in the Calder Valley, who I've been here for the last 2 months, are social distancing and are doing the right things. People understand why they have to do those things. It's for the health of themselves, the families, and the people around them. So I don't think that adversely it's going to have a massive impact on that public health message. But the reality is, this is a man that has been advising the Prime Minister to during lockdown on what is the right thing to do to save lives, and here he is breaking it. He needs to take responsibility.
You heard the question in the briefing from the vicar who suggested that members of the public who'd found themselves in similar circumstances should be able to waive their fines. He asked the question, should those fines be reviewed, do you think?
Well, I'm not sure about that. I mean, I speak to our Police and Crime Commissioner in West Yorkshire on a fairly regular basis, and I can tell you that there aren't that many fines around. But the reality is that, there is a lot of hardship that has been encountered. People have had partners die. They can't go to the hospital to see them. They can't go and then see them in the crematorium.
Would you think it would be a good idea if those fines were waived now?
Well, that is a discussion to be had, without question. But I get from my Police and Crime Commissioner that the fines that have been imposed are actually for blatant breaches in regards to people having parties and those types of things. So I think we'd have to be very, very careful. That may send out the wrong message.
Andrew Bridgen, when you see your colleagues, Conservative colleagues, feeling as strongly as they do you worry that your Prime Minister is standing by someone who's so clearly flouted the rules he helped to craft?
I think Dominic Cummings explained himself and his reasoning yesterday very well. What's clear is that this is turning into a media witch hunt. I'm not surprised the public are outraged, because the media have put rocket fuel under this. And what we do know is that a large number of the claims made when the story broke have actually proven to be completely untrue, and very few of them appear to have been retracted.
Okay, I'm just going to stop you there, Andrew, if you don't mind, just because we've had a whole piece that lays out incontrovertibly how the rules were broken. I think you heard it, that he was told to stay local and use open space near your home, as we all were. The only reasons for going out were exercise, shopping or emergencies. None of those applied to the Barnard Castle excursion. It was very difficult to argue this was exceptional, and that if his wife was infected, they shouldn't have made the journey, and if she wasn't, then they didn't need to. So on every level, what he explained yesterday clearly doesn't fit with the rules your own government set. So I'm just not understanding why you choose to blame the media for a senior political advisor breaking his own rules and watching your Prime Minister stand by that.
Well, there is leeway for childcare, and I'm sure that, given the benefit of hindsight, that his wife was not so ill that she couldn't care for their child, so they weren't both incapacitated, he would have stayed in London. But he didn't have the benefit of hindsight when he made the decision that he needed the support of his family in case that were the event. That is a perfectly logical explanation to come to.
So anyone else who'd been in that situation, just to check, in your view then, anyone else who'd been in a situation where they decided on their wife's birthday to make a 60-mile round trip to test their eyesight, that would have been fine and legitimate and understandable?
I think it's understandable that a dedicated public servant in a crucial role, a critical worker, during a crisis where he's at the very centre of deciding government policy, as soon as he was recovered, and his wife had been ill, his child had been ill, he'd been in self-isolation, as soon as he recovered and was cleared to medically return to work, wished to make a 5-hour journey, having been ill for a fortnight, and he tested whether he was capable of carrying out that journey. Now, what I put to you, Emily, is that had we replaced that critical worker, Dominic Cummings, with a doctor returning to frontline hospital 260 miles away, we wouldn't be having this debate today. I'm not sure what the difference is, apart from that the media have blown this absolutely out of proportion. Right.
So
and it's going to come back and bite the media.
I wonder why so many of your own colleagues, including many from the ERG, don't understand that then. I mean, what is it about Tory MPs and Tory ministers and even cabinet ministers that we've all heard from today who've said this is out of order? Why are they not supporting him or the Prime Minister on this?
Dominic Cummings is not someone who courts popularity within the party. He's not a member of the Conservative Party. I wouldn't say he's not a friend of mine. I don't have a particularly good relationship with him. But at the end of the day, I think a proportion of my party getting the media backlash and also getting it back from their constituents, which the media have put rocket fuel under this debate.
So your constituents can't think for themselves? Is that what you're saying, that your constituents are swayed by a media putting rocket fuel on something, not that they're shocked and might respond in the way that they feel?
What else have the media talked about for the last 4 days? And
it's quite patronising, isn't it, to your constituents to assume that they can't make up their own minds on stuff that they're hearing?
Well, they're bombarded with it 24/7, and some of my colleagues seem to be under the misapprehension that if they throw Dominic Cummings to the wolves, that they'll go away. I've always felt that you have to do what's right, and you can't feed a monster; you have to fight it.
Ian Blackford, your government in Scotland is going right now full steam ahead with track and trace. Does that still work if people aren't isolating in the way that they say they are?
No, of course it doesn't. People have to isolate if this is to work effectively. And I've had some evidence of this over the last few days, Emily, because we have had a tracing regime in the Isle of Skye where I live, and it's been very effective. And I'm glad to see that people have been following the health advice. But can I just say to you that over the course of the last 48 hours, the emails that have poured into all of us, and in my case, not just from my own constituents, but right across the United Kingdom, there is real anger that people have, that the highest official advising the Prime Minister has wantonly broken the guidance that everyone else is supposed to follow. And when you look at the response from so many Conservative MPs, and I thank them for this, those that have come out and said that he has to go, the fact that a government minister has resigned, Douglas Ross, and I feel for him because he should be the one resigning. It should be Dominic Cummings that should go. And we know that there's going to be a poll tomorrow in the Daily Mail that demonstrates that 80% of the public believe that Dominic Cummings broke the rules. That two-thirds of people do believe.
Then, Ian, I wonder why you'd bother to write this cross-party letter calling for Dominic Cummings to go on health grounds. It's the best way you've got of actually uniting all the Conservatives together by making it look like a sort of political backlash, isn't it?
No, I'm doing this, and my colleagues are doing this, because we want to make sure that the public health messages are the ones that are at the forefront. And I'm asking MPs right across the House to put pressure on the Prime Minister to remove this individual, because that poll that's in the Daily Mail tomorrow is going to suggest that two-thirds of the public believe that the public advice is being impacted by this, and as many as two-thirds of the people believe that people won't follow the government advice. This is a serious situation in a crisis, and quite simply, Dominic Cummings should have recognised that on the basis of breaking the rules, which he ought to have apologised for, he should have resigned. And the Prime Minister has to show proper leadership and recognise that this man has to go. There's no ifs, there's no buts about that.
But you, in a sense, by talking about the polls instead of about actual public health, you are letting him dominate, aren't you? I mean, if you actually want to get back to track and trace, want to get back to the public health message, you have to drill that down rather than talking about everyone, you know, going their own way and losing confidence.
Well, I can contrast what's happening in the UK with what's happening with our own Scottish Government, because that's exactly what we are doing. We're concentrating on getting the messages across. But this is, to use a good Gaelic word, this is a burach. This has become a distraction, because we cannot have a situation where the highest advisor to the Prime Minister can disregard the rules. You end up in a situation that the elite can behave one way, but the general public must behave another. And you saw that with the question from the vicar that you referred to earlier on.
Right.
Then we end up in the government even not knowing whether people should pay fines or not. This is a shambles, and it has to be brought to an end, and it should be brought to an end by Dominic Cummings being shown the door.